In 1875, the Ottoman Empire declared bankruptcy on £200 million in foreign debt. 6 years later, European creditors forced the Sultan to sign away 1/3 of the empire's total revenue, forever. The mechanism they built to extract that wealth employed 9,000 officials, more than the Ottoman finance ministry itself. This wasn't a loan restructuring. This was financial occupation dressed as debt management, and the architecture they created in Constantinople would become the blueprint for how the international financial system extracts wealth from debtor nations for the next 150 years. The patterns are still running. Right now, the story starts in 1854. The Ottoman Empire needed money to fight the Crimean War. For centuries, they'd refused foreign loans. They understood what borrowing meant, surrendering sovereignty piece by piece. But the war demanded it. Britain and France, their allies in the conflict, facilitated the first loan. £3 million at 80% of face value with 6% interest. On paper, it seemed reasonable. In reality, after commissions and discounts, the Ottomans received about £2.4 million. They were already paying more than they borrowed before a single year passed. The second loan came in 1855, £5 million. Then, 1858, another $5 million. Then 1860, $8 million. By 1863, the pattern had locked in. The empire was borrowing every single year, sometimes twice in the same year. And analysts point out something critical about how this debt spiral worked. The money wasn't funding productive investments. It wasn't building factories or infrastructure that could generate revenue to repay the loans. It was covering palace expenditures, military campaigns that ended in defeat. And most importantly, it was servicing the interest on previous loans. By the late 1860s, historians estimate that more than half of new borrowing was going straight back to European creditors as interest payments. The Ottoman government was trapped in what economists now recognize as a classic debt refinancing spiral. They had to keep borrowing just to avoid immediate default, and European bankers knew it. Interest rates climbed. By 1874, when the empire desperately needed another loan, a lot of bankers refused to lend even at 25% interest. They understood the mathematics had broken. No amount of interest could compensate for the certainty of default. But beneath the surface, another crisis was building, one that would make the debt spiral catastrophic. The Ottoman currency itself was collapsing. For decades, the empire had been debasing its coinage. The process started subtly. In 1808, Sultan Mahmud II faced enormous military expenses. Wars with Russia, wars with Persia, suppressing rebellions across the empire. The treasury was empty. Tax collection was inefficient. Corruption was endemic. So the government turned to the oldest trick in the financial playbook, debasement. They reduced the silver content of coins while maintaining the same nominal value. It created money out of thin air. In the short term, it funded government operations. In the long term, it destroyed confidence in the currency. Between 1808 and 1844, the Ottoman kuru lost over 90% of its value. What historians call the Great Debasement, the exchange rate against the British pound collapsed. In 1808, 19 kuru bought £1 sterling. By 1839, it took 106 kuru. The currency had lost more than 80% of its purchasing power in just 3 decades. Soldiers saw their real wages cut in half. In 1589, Janissaries had rioted over currency debasement. They executed the Sultan's treasurer and his economic advisor. The lesson was clear. Debasement creates inflation. Inflation creates social unrest. But the government kept doing it anyway, because the alternative was admitting they couldn't pay their bills. By 1844, the kuru was so debased the government introduced a new currency, the Ottoman lira. 1 lira equaled 100 kuru. They hoped the reset would restore confidence. It didn't, because the fundamental problem remained. The government spent more than it collected in taxes. And rather than reform the tax system or cut spending, they kept printing money. In 1840, they'd issued the first paper currency, called kim. Interest-bearing notes that functioned like bonds, 12.5% interest rates to convince people to accept them. But as more kim entered circulation, their value dropped. During the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, the government printed kim frantically to pay for the war effort. The currency depreciated 65% in 2 years. By 1880, paper money was trading at 10 to 15% of its original value. The Ottoman economy was experiencing hyperinflation. Prices for basic goods skyrocketed. The cost of living increased 18-fold between July 1914 and December 1918, but that catastrophe was still decades away. In 1873, the immediate crisis was the global financial panic. The Panic of 1873 crashed through Europe like a tsunami. Stock markets collapsed, credit markets froze, banks failed. The Vienna Stock Exchange crashed in May. By September, J. Cook & Company in the United States collapsed, triggering a cascade of failures across the Atlantic. For the Ottoman Empire, already stretched thin by debt and currency debasement, this was fatal. They couldn't refinance existing loans, they couldn't access new credit, and simultaneously, nature turned against them. Drought and floods devastated agriculture across 1873 through 1875. Harvests failed. Tax revenues, already compromised by corruption and inefficiency, collapsed. The government had to distribute emergency food to prevent mass famine. And in the Balkans, the powder keg exploded. In July 1875, Christian peasants in Herzegovina rose against their Muslim landlords. Bosnia followed, then Bulgaria in August 1876. The uprisings were brutal. Ottoman forces responded with atrocities that inflamed European public opinion. British newspapers published accounts of massacres in Bulgaria, 15,000 dead, some reports claimed. Public pressure mounted on European governments to intervene. Russia, positioning itself as protector of Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire, prepared for war. Serbia and Montenegro joined the fight in July 1876. The Ottoman military, already demoralized by pay cuts from currency debasement, struggled. They won some battles, lost others, but every campaign cost millions the empire didn't have. By October 6, 1875, the mathematics had become impossible. The empire owed £200 million. Annual debt service was £12 million, more than half the national revenue. They could only pay about £6 million. Grand Vizier Mahmud Nedum Pasha made the announcement: the Ottoman Empire would suspend half its interest payments, half in cash, half in 5% treasury bonds, that no investor would touch. This was default, sovereign bankruptcy, one of the largest financial collapses of the 19th century. European bondholders reacted with fury. In London, meetings convened immediately. British investors held massive amounts of Ottoman debt. French bondholders were equally exposed. German, Austrian, Italian, Dutch investors all faced losses. The newspapers called it betrayal. The Times ran editorials demanding government action. Bondholders organized committees. The Council of Foreign Bondholders, established in 1868 precisely for situations like this, coordinated responses. They lobbied their governments relentlessly, and their argument was simple. If the Ottoman Empire was allowed to default without consequences, it would set a precedent. Every debtor nation would try the same. The entire system of international finance would collapse. Sovereign debt had to be sacred. Repayment had to be enforced, not through markets, through power. This wasn't about economics. This was about maintaining the hierarchy of the global financial system. And European governments, representing creditor nations, agreed. What happened next reveals the true nature of international finance in the 19th century. It wasn't a free market. It was imperialism with interest rates. The Ottoman government tried to negotiate with individual creditor groups, but the European powers wanted a coordinated solution, one that would give them collective leverage. In April 1877, Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 was devastating. Ottoman forces fought bravely, but were outmatched. Russian armies pushed through the Balkans. They reached the outskirts of Constantinople by January 1878. The Ottoman government, facing total defeat, signed the Treaty of San Stefano in March 1878. The terms were catastrophic. Russia would create a massive Bulgarian state, essentially a Russian puppet. Romania, Serbia, Montenegro would gain independence. The Ottoman Empire would lose its richest European territories, and it would pay enormous war indemnities to Russia. But Britain and Austria-Hungary refused to accept San Stefano. A Russian-dominated Bulgaria would give Russia control of the Balkans. It would threaten British routes to India. It would upset the entire European balance of power. So they demanded a Congress, a gathering of the great powers, to revise the treaty, to prevent Russian hegemony, and critically, to address the Ottoman debt crisis. In June and July 1878, Europe's leaders gathered in Berlin. Chancellor Otto von Bismarck hosted Britain, sent Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli and Foreign Secretary Lord Salisbury. Russia, France, Austria-Hungary, Italy, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire all sent delegations. Greece, Romania, Serbia, Montenegro attended sessions about their territories, but weren't full members. They were subjects, not participants. The Congress of Berlin redrew the map of southeastern Europe. It dismantled the large Bulgaria envisioned at San Stefano. It recognized the independence of Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro. It allowed Austria-Hungary to occupy Bosnia and Herzegovina. It gave Britain administrative control of Cyprus. Russia kept some territorial gains, but far less than San Stefano had granted. And in Protocol 18, something unprecedented happened. For the first time in history, the great powers inserted debt settlement into an international treaty. The protocol stated that the European powers would negotiate with the Ottoman government on behalf of private bondholders. Debt repayment became a matter of international diplomacy, backed by the implicit threat of military force. The treaty also did something else. It forced newly independent Balkan states to assume portions of the Ottoman debt. Bulgaria, though not fully independent, would bear a share proportional to its revenue. Serbia and Montenegro would pay based on equitable calculations. Financial obligations transferred with territory. The debt followed the land. This was revolutionary. Private financial claims were now enforced through international treaties and great power pressure. And the message to the Ottoman Empire was clear. You will pay, or we will take control of your finances and make you pay. In 1879, Britain sent warships to the Dardanelles. Naval power anchored off Constantinople. Diplomatic pressure intensified. The Ottoman government had already lost vast territories. Its tax base had shrunk dramatically. Its currency was worthless. Its economy was in ruins. And now it faced the choice between accepting foreign financial control or facing military intervention. They negotiated, first, with local creditors in Constantinople, the Galata bankers who'd lent short-term funds to keep the government operating. In November 1879, the government reached an agreement. It would surrender control of 6 indirect revenue sources: stamp taxes, spirit taxes, fishing taxes, silk tithes, salt monopoly, tobacco monopoly. These revenues would be managed by representatives of the Ottoman Bank and local creditors. The administration of the 6 indirect contributions, and remarkably, it worked. Tax collection improved dramatically. Revenues proved sufficient to service the domestic debt. Ottoman subjects paid more in taxes than they had under Ottoman administration. Because European financial experts eliminated corruption, they standardized procedures, they enforced collection. Foreign bondholders watched this success with frustration. They had accepted restructuring talks. They'd waited patiently. And now they saw that the Ottoman Empire could pay its debts, if properly administered. By foreigners, they demanded a similar arrangement for the external debt. Their governments pressed the issue. Negotiations began in October 1880. They lasted over a year. The Ottoman government fought to preserve some financial sovereignty. The creditors demanded total control. And in December 1881, Sultan Abdülhamit II signed the Decree of Muharrem, the document that would govern Ottoman finances for the next 4 decades. The decree restructured the entire external debt. It reduced the nominal amount from £215 million to £129 million, a 40% reduction. Annual debt service dropped from £13.6 million to £2.7 million, an 80% cut. European creditors accepted massive losses on paper, but in exchange, they received something far more valuable than immediate repayment. They received permanent control over Ottoman revenue streams. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration was born. The structure of the EBDA was brilliantly designed for one purpose: extraction. 7 representatives sat on the council, 1 from Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, the Netherlands, and 1 representing Ottoman creditors, plus 1 representative from the Ottoman state, 8 members total. But the Ottoman representative had no vote on most matters. The presidency rotated between British and French representatives who held the largest shares of Ottoman debt. The ABD received irrevocable control over specific revenue sources: the salt monopoly across the empire, the tobacco monopoly, stamp taxes, alcohol taxes, fishing taxes, silk tithes, and customs duties at major ports, including Istanbul. If these proved insufficient, the EBTA had claims on indemnities paid by Balkan states under the Treaty of Berlin. Historians estimate approximately 1/5 to 1/3 of all Ottoman state revenue flowed directly to the OPDA, not to the Ottoman treasury first, directly to European banks. The OPDA collected taxes from Ottoman subjects and sent the money abroad without the Ottoman government touching it. This was unprecedented. Foreign control of sovereign revenue had happened before in limited ways, but never at this scale, never this systematically, never with this level of institutional permanence. The OPDA wasn't a temporary arrangement. It was designed to last until every penny of debt was repaid. Decades, potentially generations. And the EBDA built its own state within the Ottoman state. It hired 5,000 employees initially: tax collectors, customs officials, administrators, accountants, inspectors, enforcement officers, all paid by the EPDA, all accountable to the OPDA Council, not to Ottoman ministers. By its peak, the OPDA employed 9,000 people, more employees than the Ottoman Finance Ministry, a parallel bureaucracy with greater resources and higher efficiency. These officials collected taxes directly from Ottoman subjects. They enforced monopolies on salt and tobacco, inspected merchant ships and warehouses, prosecuted smugglers, maintained detailed financial records, and they operated under extraterritorial legal privileges. OPDA officials answered to EPDA tribunals, not Ottoman courts. If a dispute arose over tax collection or monopoly enforcement, EPDA courts decided Ottoman law didn't bind them. This was a sovereignty violation on a massive scale. Foreign employees collecting taxes on foreign authority inside Ottoman territory, and the system worked with devastating efficiency. Within the first decade, revenues from EBDA-controlled sources increased 50% in some categories, not because the Ottoman economy was booming, because European administrators eliminated the corruption and inefficiency that had plagued Ottoman tax collection for centuries. They introduced double-entry bookkeeping, standardized accounting practices, transparent financial reporting, professional management systems, regular audits, performance monitoring. Everything modern financial administration requires. And historians note the bitter irony. The OPDA proved the Ottoman Empire could be governed efficiently, could collect taxes effectively, could operate with financial discipline, just not by Ottomans. The implicit message was clear. Eastern peoples couldn't manage their own affairs. They needed Western expertise, Western discipline, Western control. This narrative would echo through the next century of imperial history. But the EPDA did more than collect taxes. It became the gateway for European investment into the Ottoman Empire. European companies wanted to build railways, mine coal and minerals, develop ports and infrastructure. But they worried about Ottoman government reliability. Whether contracts would be honored, whether profits could leave the country, whether regulations would change capriciously, the EBDA provided guarantees. Because the EBDA controlled Ottoman revenues, it could ensure European investors got paid. It could structure deals where project revenues flowed through OPDA accounts. It could enforce contracts using its extraterritorial legal authority. By 1900, the OPDA was financing massive railway construction across Anatolia, mining concessions, port development. Billions in modern currency flowed into Ottoman territory through OPDA-facilitated investments. And analysts point out that this development wasn't designed to benefit the Ottoman economy broadly. Railways ran where they served European commercial interests, from ports to interior regions with exportable resources, not connecting Ottoman cities. Mining concessions extracted coal, copper, chrome, and shipped them to European factories, not to fuel Ottoman industrial development. Port facilities handled European import-export needs, not Ottoman domestic shipping. The Ottoman Empire was being structurally integrated into European capitalism in a subordinate position, as a periphery to the European core, supplying raw materials, consuming manufactured goods, generating profits that flowed outward. Economic historians describe this as peripheralization, and the EBDA was the mechanism that enforced it. The model spread rapidly. Egypt had already established the Caisse de la Dette Publique in 1876. Anglo-French financial controllers managing Egyptian government finances, Tunisia came under similar arrangements. French control of Tunisian finances as debt crisis followed debt crisis. Other struggling states watched and learned. Default on foreign debt, lose financial sovereignty, accept foreign administrators dictating economic policy. Watch as domestic resources get redirected to creditor repayment regardless of social cost. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration operated for 43 years, from 1881 to 1924. Through multiple crises, the Young Turk Revolution, the Balkan Wars, World War I, the collapse of the empire itself, even after the Ottoman government ceased to exist, the EBDA kept operating. When the Republic of Turkey finally emerged in 1923, one of the new government's first battles was the debt. The Treaty of Lausanne and Paris Conference forced Turkey to accept 62% of pre-1912 Ottoman debt, 77% of post-1912 debt. The principle was established. Successor states inherit predecessor debts. Even revolutionary governments remain bound by financial obligations. The debt follows the territory, follows the people, never dies. Now fast forward exactly 101 years from the Ottoman default. August 1982, Mexico City. Finance Minister Silva Herzog announces Mexico can no longer service $80 billion in foreign debt. The declaration hits international markets like an earthquake, because Mexico isn't alone. Brazil carries massive debt. Argentina is overextended. Venezuela, Chile, Peru, dozens of developing nations across Latin America borrowed heavily during the 1970s. When oil prices were high and commodity exports generated revenue, when international banks were flush with petrodollars and lending aggressively, the debt seemed manageable. Until it wasn't. In 1979, Paul Volcker became chair of the U.S. Federal Reserve. He raised interest rates dramatically to fight American inflation. The federal funds rate hit 20%. This crushed inflation in the United States but devastated debtor nations, because most developing country debt was denominated in U.S. dollars with variable interest rates tied to U.S. rates. When American rates skyrocketed, debt service costs for developing nations exploded. Simultaneously, the strong dollar crushed commodity prices. Oil, copper, agricultural exports all declined in value. Debtor nations saw revenues fall just as debt payments surged. Mexico defaulted first, but the crisis spread rapidly. By 1983, over 40 countries had rescheduled debt or were in arrears. The total exposure of international banks exceeded their capital reserves. This was the Third World Debt Crisis, and it demanded a response. The International Monetary Fund had been created in 1944 at Bretton Woods. Its original mission was maintaining exchange rate stability. But in 1982, Managing Director Jacques de Larosière transformed the institution. He created a model for crisis response that economists would later call structural adjustment. The IMF would provide emergency loans to prevent immediate default, but only if borrowing countries agreed to fundamental economic reforms. Managing Director Michel Camdesis called this transformation a silent revolution. The specific reforms were crystallized in programs launched in 1986 and 1987. The conditions followed a consistent pattern: privatize state-owned enterprises, eliminate subsidies on fuel and food, reduce government spending, liberalize trade, deregulate markets, restructure tax systems, cut public employment, reduce wages, open to foreign investment, float currency, remove capital controls. The stated justification was economic efficiency: eliminate waste, promote competition, attract foreign capital, restore growth. The actual impact was wealth extraction on a massive scale. And the parallels to the OPDA are stunning. Just as the EOP demanded control of Ottoman revenues in exchange for debt restructuring, the IMF demanded control of economic policy in exchange for emergency loans. Just as the EBDA operated with minimal accountability to the Ottoman government, IMF officials set macroeconomic targets with minimal input from debtor governments. Just as OPDA priorities favored creditor repayment over Ottoman social welfare, IMF programs prioritized debt service over healthcare, education, poverty reduction. The mechanisms are nearly identical. Researchers analyzing IMF programs from 1980 through 2018 published findings in 2021. Structural adjustment conditions are statistically associated with increased poverty. The relationship is significant across regions, across time periods, across different types of developing economies. The effect is causal, and the mechanism is straightforward. Cutting government spending reduces access to healthcare and education for the poor. Eliminating food and fuel subsidies raises costs for basic necessities. Privatization leads to job losses, tax restructuring increases, consumption taxes that hit the poor hardest. Trade liberalization exposes domestic industries to global competition they can't match. At the same time, efficiency improves from a creditor perspective. Government revenues increase through better tax collection. Deficits shrink. Debt service resumes. Money flows back to international banks. But the social cost is catastrophic. Argentina provides the starkest example. Through the 1990s, Argentina followed IMF prescriptions religiously. Privatized state industries pegged the peso to the dollar, liberalized capital flows, reduced government spending. The IMF praised Argentina as a model student. Then 2001 hit, and the economy imploded. Unemployment exceeded 20%. Poverty rates soared above 50%. The government imposed the Corralito restrictions on bank withdrawals to prevent capital flight. People couldn't access their own money. In December 2001, riots exploded in Buenos Aires. Protesters banged pots and pans in the streets. Police responded with violence. 39 people died. President Fernando de la Rúa appeared on television to declare a state of emergency. The protests intensified. He resigned and fled the presidential palace by helicopter. 5 presidents cycled through office in 2 weeks. The country defaulted on $100 billion. The IMF's response was to withhold further support, which accelerated the collapse. Banks failed. Over 25% of deposits were withdrawn in panic. The peso collapsed. Inflation skyrocketed. Middle-class families lost their savings. Poverty became widespread among people who'd been comfortable just months before. And then, incredibly, the exact same pattern repeated. In 2018, Argentina took a $57 billion loan from the IMF, the largest in IMF history, with the same conditions: austerity, spending cuts, structural reforms. The economy contracted, inflation surged, poverty increased. By 2019, Macri lost re-election. The new government inherited the debt and the IMF conditions. The cycle continues. Borrow face crisis. Accept IMF conditions, suffer social cost, fail to grow, need more borrowing. It's the same trap the Ottoman Empire fell into. Borrow to cover deficits, can't generate enough growth to repay. Borrow more to service existing debt, sovereignty erodes. This is what scholars mean when they describe modern emerging market debt traps as echoes of 19th century imperial financial collapse. The Ottoman case pioneered every element: direct seizure of government revenues by creditor representatives, loss of policy autonomy, insertion of debt into international treaties, military pressure to enforce compliance, creation of permanent bureaucracies accountable to creditors rather than debtor governments, systematic prioritization of debt service over social spending, structuring of investment and trade to benefit creditor nations. Every single element reappears in IMF structural adjustment programs. The vocabulary changed from colonial to multilateral, but the structure remained identical. And if current trends continue, emerging markets will spend decades in the same position the Ottoman Empire occupied: technically sovereign with their own flags, practically subordinate with economic policy dictated by foreign institutions. History demonstrates that financial architecture, once constructed, resists change. The OPD model spread because it worked beautifully, not for Ottoman citizens or debtor populations, but for European creditors and investors. It provided legal frameworks for extracting wealth without the administrative costs of formal colonization. No need to conquer territory and govern populations directly. Just control the finances, collect the revenues, enforce the contracts. Let local governments maintain the appearance of sovereignty, while real power sits with creditors. That model now operates at truly global scale. Not through conspiracy or malice necessarily, but through structure and incentives. Creditor nations and institutions genuinely believe structural adjustment promotes growth. They point to efficiency gains, reduced corruption, improved governance. But the lived experience in debtor nations tells a different story: of factories closing, of hospitals understaffed, of schools without resources, of pensions cut. of subsidies eliminated, of people suffering while money flows abroad. The documentation is extensive. Academic research has mapped these dynamics in tremendous detail. The question isn't whether the parallels between the EBTA and modern debt management exist. The question is whether anyone with power to change the system has any incentive to do so. Because from the creditor perspective, the system works perfectly. Loans get repaid. Countries maintain market access by demonstrating willingness to comply. Investors earn returns. Banks stay profitable. The fact that populations in debtor countries suffer is treated as unfortunate but necessary. Short-term pain for long-term gain, there is no alternative. But the Ottoman example shows us where this logic leads. The empire never recovered financial sovereignty. It never escaped the debt trap. It generated revenues for 4 decades that enriched European banks, while Ottoman infrastructure crumbled, education stagnated, and military capacity declined, until finally the empire itself dissolved, torn apart by internal nationalism and external pressure. Leaving successor states still bound by financial obligations incurred generations earlier. This is the enduring lesson. Debt doesn't just extract wealth now, it binds the future. It transfers power permanently from debtor to creditor. And once established, that transfer proves almost impossible to reverse, short of complete collapse or revolution. The mathematics of compound interest ensure that without sustained high-growth debt spirals, and the structure of the international system ensures that growth, when it happens, primarily benefits creditor nations. Debtor nations export commodities at volatile prices, import manufactured goods at stable prices, pay interest to foreign banks. Economic activity occurs, but value flows outward, until the debtor state finds itself like the Ottoman Empire in 1881, signing away revenue streams for generations to come. Not because of poor governance alone, though that contributes, but because the system is designed to produce exactly this outcome. Debt creates dependency. Dependency creates control. And control, once established through financial architecture, like the EBDA or IMF structural adjustment, becomes remarkably durable. The patterns run forward from Constantinople to Buenos Aires, to Athens, to Colombo. Different countries, different decades, same mechanisms, same outcomes. Permanent revenue extraction across generations until the debtor state itself ceases to exist.